Today's topic is going to be about the decline of StarCraft 2, specifically the viewership. And the reason I decided to do this is because it's such a vague event, a vague straw man, if you will, where basically everybody uses like the decline of StarCraft 2 and then they all have their own reasons as to why they think it happened, and then they use that to justify their own argumentation. But as far as I can see, nobody actually has the correct answer, and I don't think anybody will unless we actually get the viewing numbers and how the demographics broke down, and then somebody would be smart enough to like compare and contrast the fame, and the engagement and all those different things to all the different factors, and then maybe make some kind of like graph over time to figure out what was causing all of this in comparison to like the other games or the other streaming things, and how that breaks down in terms of audience and demographics and stuff like that. But as far as I know, nobody's ever done that. As far as I know, nobody's ever even come close to doing that. And so I'm just going to break down the more common reasons as to why people think StarCraft 2 died, even though obviously there's still a tournament scene with GSL and WCS. But even with that tournament scene, you have to accept the fact that there's much less teams in the space, much less sponsors, and much less viewership. And it's actually not. There are actually a few things we should point out. From the very get-go, StarCraft 2 didn't start off on a strong foot. And what I mean by that is, they were the first big esports game on Justin TV/Twitch in the early on period, because it just happened to be hit at the right time, at the right moment. But even before that, like, StarCraft 2 went off on the wrong foot in South Korea, which has been the most important city for StarCraft before StarCraft 2 came out. And that's because of the giant like battle between Blizzard and OGN/Kespa for the IP rights of Brood War, right? And so basically what happens is, because they can't agree on that, they get they get GSL to do the GSL, back then known as GomTV, I think. They get them to do the tournaments, and while it's like it's successful internationally, it would never be successful domestically, as the big esports games in South Korea are all viewed on TV, and they're all like big domestic leagues. So even like smaller games like Kart Rider or Sudden Attack, or there's a few other ones that I forget the name of, like they still like had a scene, even though they had much less viewership than everybody else, just because it was a national scene, so to speak, and they were backed by the OGN and I suppose MSL before that went kaput. And so that's also obviously one of the reasons as to why StarCraft 2 was already off in terms of South Korea. And the way it worked in the PC bongs, it was way too expensive. So for instance, in Brood War, there was a cloning aspect of the original game where you only needed one CD, I believe, and then the entire like LAN cafe could play it. So because of that, it was not only cheap for each of the LAN cafes to get this game, it was also very easy. It was also very easy to play on like a low requirements computer. It was pretty fast, and obviously because of the way the game works, where there's like a single player, there's a multiplayer, and then there's a bunch of user map settings games, it gives like a wide plethora of different types of game modes that anybody can pick up and play. So it hits like a bunch of the different check marks, so to speak. Whereas StarCraft 2, you need a Blizzard account, you need your own game, and I'm not exactly sure how it worked in LAN cafes in South Korea early on, but I'm pretty sure it was the same case back then. So in order to play this game, I think you would have to like download the client or something ridiculous, which would take a long time. And obviously you're going out there in a LAN cafe, it's more of a social setting than it is like sit down and hardcore grind by yourself. And that's generally how it is in Asian LAN cafes. They're more of like a party. They're more like a social gathering with video games as like the tool so to speak, and that's why it never really got off the ground. Because even though it's like a 1v1 game, because it's a 1v1 game, obviously, but it also didn't have the extra aspects that made Brood War so popular in the beginning. And then there's also the fact that you have to point out it's an RTS game. RTS as a genre is incredibly small. And as far as I know, like there's only been like one or two very big RTS games. There's StarCraft, and then there's like the Age of series, stuff like that, right? And it could just be the case that StarCraft 2 was never meant to stay big. Because of time and of waning interest in the game is not kind of natural the longer you progress. Even when you look at, say, Brood War, that was actually a national sort of interest in South Korea only, and it never really spread outside of that. So there are a bunch of reasons as to why it worked in South Korea and why it wouldn't have worked everywhere else, but there are too many to go into. There's another point that comes up later in the timescales called, like, people called it negativity. I think this one's pretty much bullshit. There's no way you can actually prove negativity hurt anything, and it doesn't really make sense just because, like, nobody really cares about negativity. No sponsor would really care about negativity if you could just prove to them you have the numbers, you have the viewership, you have the engagement anyway. And so it doesn't really make much sense unless you're trying to con them into something that may not be there. So I don't really see the logic in that one. And I don't really know how much anybody can tangibly measure that effect. And I don't think, put it this way, Dota 2 is one of the most negative communities out there. I don't think they'll be offended by me saying that. I mean, if you've ever played a Dota 2 game within 10 games, you will understand like the inherent rage that comes with playing that particular game. So, and they've obviously done very well for themselves. So, I don't think negativity is part of it. And then there's also like the FGC, which was a smaller scene back then, but they have been incredibly negative their entire like lifespan. I've been following them for a long time, and they are in many ways more negative than the StarCraft 2 community was at like its worst. So I don't think of that as like a particularly valid reason. And then we come into a very complicated one. It's called the Broodlord Infestor reason, and this one was popularized mostly by Total Biscuit because obviously he was a big proponent of StarCraft 2 back then, but he completely lost interest in the game once Broodlord Infestor came into the scene as like the go-to strategy. And to be fair to everybody, he was right. Everybody who was watching those games, or everybody who was watching those games for a prolonged period should have been tired of those games, because Broodlord Infestor was probably the most strategically and tactically stale meta I'd like to say in like the last 6 years of all of esports I've watched, just because of the length of time it lasted, and then the amount of excuses that were given from the Blizzard like balanced team. Like some of the more famous ones I remember off the top of my head were like it's balanced just because it's balanced on the ladder all the way down. I'm like, what the hell is this? Because there's something crazy like, oh, it's balanced, guys, because on the ladder it's close to 50% win rate for each race, and that's not really how you should think of it. Because obviously we were talking about the top pro games, and if you want, you can just look through that period, and obviously Zerg was super dominant. And if you just look at and actually I should point this out, balance percent doesn't really matter to me as much as it is about the game design. So for instance, TVZ in 2010 to 2011 was completely fine with me, even though I think the overall win rates were much higher for Terran than it was for Zerg. I think it might have been like 10 to 15% more in total, just for the top players I was looking at, but I never saw a complaint about that, and the reason was because the dynamic of the game itself was so interesting and so good that even though Zerg was like hard done by just because of the maps, because of the knowledge, because of the meta, nobody really complained because it was interesting to watch, it was interesting to play, and you couldn't really say the same for the Broodlord Infestor era. So that's a valid reason, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the matter just because it's not like Broodlord Infestor lasted for the entirety of StarCraft 2's peak. There's obviously like 2013, which was a still very good year for StarCraft 2, and during then like there was no Broodlord Infestor was only in the early part of that year, and then they switched over to Heart of the Swarm, which obviously nerfed that shit to the ground, or tried to. It came back just under a different name known as Stormhost, but that's a different topic, right? So the next excuse I've heard pretty often that I think at this point has proven to have no basis in reality is there were too many good Korean players. And the reason that I think this one has no basis in reality is because we've seen League of Legends, we've seen Overwatch League now, and there are plenty of Koreans in those leagues and all across the world, and viewership has risen, viewership has been fine. And when we're talking, and it's not as if we're talking about like vaguely groups of Koreans and vaguely groups of foreigners. We're actually talking about specific types of people. So some Koreans will be more popular than some foreigners, and vice versa. Obviously, if you get a foreigner who is both incredibly skilled and is like locally huge, obviously I'm thinking of somebody like Stefano, they will naturally be the most popular. But even cases like Flash or Jaedong, Parting, Life, MVP, these types of guys, they'd be incredibly popular even if they don't have that cultural or social background, even with the fact that there's obviously not that much content built around them to build up their storylines, right? So I'll go ahead and say I think this one was bunk. Too many Koreans doesn't make much sense. And then we get into there were two contrasting opinions that I thought were pretty interesting. So in 2013, when WCS was created, there were actually two opinions I found. One of them was from somebody from MLG who basically said he thought this was the reason StarCraft 2 declined, was because of the way WCS was structured. It kind of forced out a bunch of the competing tournament organizers, and this in turn made the tournaments more stale, more boring, rote. It basically didn't create enough competition, and it wasn't like strong enough in and of itself to build up hype and excitement over the year. The other one I heard was that it wasn't the fact that WCS was created, it was that it was created too late. And this was something I think Richard Lewis said, where basically you needed a structure so that some level, like there's a level between casual and hardcore, and then in between that level, there's in between that level, a fan is like the type of fan who is like interested, but they need a very easy way to digest that content. Obviously, with a bunch of tournaments going on, and you have to find it out yourself. Like Reddit can help a little bit, but it's generally pretty hard to know without like an obvious schedule or which are the big events to look towards to. And he felt like that obviously you needed some kind of structure, and LCS and CSGO have kind of shown this to bear fruit to a certain extent. I will say that League of Legends doesn't, and CSGO have a bunch of mitigating circumstances that don't necessarily make this true. And obviously the other counterpoint to that would be like FGC has grown stronger, so to speak, without the super structured like top-down structure. They basically just this year, in the previous 2017 year, the most they did was just add like the Capcom Pro Tour points and stuff like that, right? And that's not necessarily like a top-down structure like what the WCS was trying to implement. And obviously there's Dota 2, which they kind of feel like that entire scene kind of feels like the major system that they implemented in the last 2 years before the current year actually hurt the scene more than it helped the scene. So take from it what you will. It's actually a complicated subject, and I don't have the answer as to which of the views is more correct than the other. I think it's actually highly dependent on the scene and where it's at the time. Another reason, I think, and this is one that obviously nobody ever brings up because fans are sort of not willing to pay. I think one of the biggest reasons actually StarCraft 2 declined is because the MLG Arena thing failed. Now, I will say that they did it wrong. So for those who don't know, I'll provide some context because I'm skipping a few points. But basically, MLG was one of the biggest StarCraft 2 tournament organizers early on. And they reached a point where they kind of realized we can't really make money off of this unless the fans are willing to pay. So they tried to do a pay-per-view model where there was I think it was $10 for to watch an event. And they got ripped to shreds just in terms of social media. And I think they ran a few of these before they finally just quit it because obviously it wasn't making enough money to sustain it. It was probably losing money, is my guess, just based off of the viewership count and how much it would take to fly people over. And that's already losing money. It's not even including salaries, tournaments, cost opportunities, stuff like this. So I'm assuming that already cost them a lot of money. And the reason I think this is one of the bigger reasons as to why you could say StarCraft 2 declined is because if you were able to create a viewership base that was willing to pay for content, then it wouldn't really matter if the viewership numbers went down because the viewership per capita is way better, and viewership per cap dollars per the spending power of each viewer would be higher, so to speak. And in that case, it doesn't matter if the viewership numbers are lower, just because they have a provable metric where these viewers are willing to put money into the game in such a way. So this helps tournaments, this helps them get sponsors, and obviously this never worked out because viewers didn't want to pay. So I mean, that's just how it is. I don't actually blame viewers for this because I mean, you pay it if you want. There's no responsibility on the viewer to pay for it if they don't like the product, so to speak. And I think this was way too early in the life cycle of StarCraft 2, and not just because I don't think the viewers are ready. And on top of that, they didn't really know how to do it correctly. Obviously, the best example of doing it correctly would be TI Dota 2, and that goes into the next point, which is skins. A lot of people think skins could have saved the game. I'm not actually certain it would have, because basically the idea of skins and microtransactions wasn't even an idea when StarCraft 2 was in development and when it was released. So obviously League of Legends became big because it became free to play, and then the microtransactions that happened after that. But that it didn't become big until after StarCraft 2 was already released, and so those ideas weren't really in the sphere of game developers' minds. So because of that, I'm not actually sure if the technology was really there yet, so to speak. And that's obviously a huge underlying problem, and obviously we do have them now with the battle chests for StarCraft 2. And so that's a much better way to get the money from the viewers into the game in a way that both sides can benefit, because you're not just getting the stale sort of viewing experience of you just buy and watch this event. Because nowadays I think you need more than that to get a viewer enticed in some way to be willing to put down money on it. So that's just my personal view. And finally, we're going to get into a oddly specific topic about saturation. And it wasn't really saturations, as in like there was too many tournaments or there were too few tournaments. It was the question of there were too many of the same type of tournaments. And this is where this is kind of tied into the idea of the structured format earlier about the WCS. So basically the idea was because you were getting the same types of players, usually you were getting the same types of production, you were getting the same types of talent, you were getting the same types of product. Eventually, like you keep selling the same burger, so to speak, to the same customer. Eventually they're going to go somewhere else because they want to try something new. They're tired of that flavor or whatever. There's obviously been a few events that have like kept their unique flavor. Home Story Cup is probably the biggest one. GSL has always had that prestige of being the most competitive tournament in the world, so they will always have that. But as for every other tournament organizer, they've kind of like melded together, so to speak. And so it was kind of hard to differentiate from each other. And obviously, like they never really got the chance because of how WCS worked out in 2013. And from that point going forward, or it could have just been an excuse. Maybe they really decided they had wasted way too much money into StarCraft 2 and wanted to pivot into games that were more profitable. It's hard to say without being a part of that and knowing people in that process, right? And finally, there's the bit about narrative, I guess. And obviously, I think this one's kind of bull just because I don't really think anybody really tried that hard to create narratives. Obviously, it was a different time period, and you have to think about the budgets. So I don't think anybody had the extra money to like go film a documentary, go film a video, go do these things. Obviously, you could do written art content, but I think everybody knows that written content has like a limited appeal. It has a very limited appeal. So even if I wrote like a banger about like Naniwa, who's arguably one of the most popular StarCraft 2 players to ever touch the game, that's not really going to convert into anything substantial for a tournament, so to speak. Not really. I mean, it's just a nice add-on for the hardcore fans, but it's not really a piece of content that will necessarily like grab and latch onto a casual fan or casual turning hardcore fan like TI documentary might, or a CSGO documentary might, or the way the LCS do a bunch of their high content videos, stuff like this. And obviously, I also have to point out that I don't really blame them just because tournament organizers don't have the time or money. And at the same time, the teams that were running StarCraft 2 players and teams didn't really understand this. Obviously, none of the South Korean teams had a clue as to how to run their organizations. And the proof of that is that there's only like one or two orgs from the entire from like the dozen or so StarCraft 2 orgs that have popped up in Korea at the beginning. Only two of them have survived. I am now Longzhu and MVP for different reasons. And the other reason you have to look at is that a lot of them never thought about content creation. And obviously, like some of them thought about team houses and like, oh, maybe we'll practice and do something like that. But only EG went like the extra step, like, oh, if we have everybody here, not only can we practice, we can stream, but we can also make content around our creators, around our players, and get that to get engagement, to get views and whatever, right? So from a narrative standpoint, you could point out at like the narrative storytelling was weak in StarCraft 2, but to say that it was the primary reason to kill StarCraft 2, I think that's stretching it by a lot. So basically, those were all the main reasons as to why StarCraft 2 died out, if you want to call it that. And as I pointed out, none of them actually fit the bill as the primary suspect, and but all of them had some sort of effect on the scene, but we don't really know how much or to what extent. It's hard to measure something like that. But there is one thing we can say, I guess, and that is the fact that the primary mover in all of this, and the person, or not the person, but the organization, you can put the primary responsibility of the decline of StarCraft 2 on is Blizzard. And just that's because obviously they've had a hand in a bunch of these different things because they were they were too slow basically. Like throughout my time in following StarCraft 2, they eventually got around to fixing things, but it always came down to it was too late, and like it overcompensated for their mistakes later on. So obviously, like they get OGN back on board, but it's like 3 years later. They get Kespa back on board, but it's like 3 years too late. They fetched Broodlord and Fester, but that took 1.5 years and a new expansion. And then after that, they basically got burned so hard by that. Like the way they patched things, I don't actually agree with a number of them just because they were overreactions to things that I think could have been solved naturally anyway. But that's an entire different like discourse. And obviously there's the skins, which are like 5 years too late. Actually, I don't know if they're 5 years too late, but they're definitely late. And I think in general, like Blizzard's been good, but they've always been too slow, too reactionary, too stuck in the middle. Just in terms of like all their decisions, like whether or not you think WCS should have been made or not, it was probably too late. And obviously there's I think one of the biggest underlying issue is that Blizzard didn't really understand how to cater to both casual and hardcore player base or the audience base. And this kind of applies to Overwatch as well. But basically, my problem with Blizzard is I don't think they understand either side of what makes a casual player casual and what makes a hardcore player hardcore. So I'll explain it like this. A casual player is the numerous casual players, most of them are going to be playing single player, and then they drop out and play something else. Among those who play single player, a small percentage of them will play online, but majority of those would probably play UMS games or fun like team games, stuff like this. And then a small percentage of those would play the 1v1 games. And then at the point where you play the 1v1 ladder games, that's when I think you're basically a hardcore player. And so the way a Blizzard often addressed this was they tried to appease both hardcore and casual players through balance changes, but I actually think balance changes only affect hardcore players. They don't affect casual players. And that's kind of my view on it, where basically they were using the wrong tool to appeal to the casual fan base. And I think they got that later on when they made the co-op mode, but this is just a hypothesis of mine. It's not like I have any measurable data to prove it one way or the other. But those are the many causes of the decline of StarCraft 2. As to what I think about all of this, basically the whole point of this is just to prove that there were so many different reasons as to why you could point as to the decline of StarCraft 2, and I don't think any of them could be provably made as the primary reason. And so when we talk about StarCraft 2 historically, or as an example, or used to bring it up as an argument about like the state of the scene or whatever, you have to think of the fact that it's way more complicated than just one reason as to why something went down, or as to why the popularity of StarCraft 2 went down. So those are my thoughts, and hopefully one day we'll get the viewing numbers, or we'll get any of that information, and maybe you will have a definitive reason as to why. All right, see you later.